God tells us what the mission is. He tells us why we're doing it. He gives some general guidelines as to how we're going to do it. And then he invites us to make a million little tactical decisions along the way. And as long as we have clearly heard his commander's intent, and as long as the tactical decisions we make are in keeping with that intent, we are going to complete the mission. This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm interested in getting better at knowing, understanding, and acting on the commander's intent. Meaning, God has sent us on a mission, and we need to know what that mission is, why we're doing it, and what the basic parameters are for how we're going to get it done. For the last 3 episodes, I've worked through this process of finding our commander's intent in each of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. I'm going to do more of that in future episodes, so stay tuned if that's been helpful. But as I was putting these episodes together, I kept finding more and more value not just in the commander's intent as a strategy for reading any given part of the Bible, but also for getting my head around what the Bible is and what part it plays in my life with God, using this idea of the commander's intent as a framing device for figuring that out. If you Google the phrase commander's intent, you'll end up watching a lot of videos or listening to a lot of podcasts involving Jocko Willink. Jocko's basic point in talking about the commander's intent is that when we as leaders communicate plans, expectations, strategies, all that to the people we are leading, it is absolutely critical that we don't communicate every little tiny tactical detail. Instead, we communicate what the mission is, why we're doing it, and need to know broad parameters in play that constrain how we accomplish it. That's it. We're going to take that hilltop for this reason. Here are the resources available to us to make that happen. Done. I, as a leader, am not telling my people exactly how to take every incremental step along the way. I am training and empowering them to make those decisions. And by the way, I'll come back to this a little later. If I only communicate the what of the mission, the why of the mission, and the broad parameters for the how of the mission, but the people on the ground don't know what they're doing, or if there's a lack of trust for whatever reason between me and them, this isn't going to work. So there are some other factors that have to be in place here. Hold that thought. For now, assuming these things are in place, I need to train and trust the people on the front lines. This is what Jocko calls decentralized command. The guy on the ground makes the call because he's the guy on the ground. The guy at the home office communicates what the mission is, why the mission is, and what the broad parameters are within which that mission must get done, and then leaves the guy on the ground alone to do it. But when I say leaves him alone, I don't mean abandons, I mean trusts. And there's another conversation worth having about this, because depending on your personality, your working genius, that sort of thing, there is a lot of headache potential when a boss thinks they are communicating trust, but what the subordinate receives is abandonment. Again, more on that another time. What I want to do in this episode is show you how this idea of decentralized command, this way of communicating the commander's intent, how this is what God does for us. God tells us what the mission is. He tells us why we're doing it. He gives some general guidelines as to how we're going to do it. And then he invites us to make a million little tactical decisions along the way. And as long as we have clearly heard the commander's intent, and as long as the tactical decisions we make are in keeping with that intent, we're going to complete the mission. Here's the short version of all this. God is not a micromanager. Micromanaging means deciding the tactics, not just the broad parameters of what the subordinates are going to do, but how and when and where and every last detail. That's micromanaging. God doesn't do that. This might surprise you. God doesn't mandate tactics almost ever. He communicates the mission, the reason for the mission, and the broad strategic parameters for accomplishing the mission. Done. The Bible is way less specific, tactically speaking, than we tend to think. And maybe you've heard the one about there being 613 laws in the Old Testament. So much detail, so specific, so burdensome and focused on tiny little minutia. That's nonsense. 613 laws to govern an entire nation. Economics, agriculture, calendar, law enforcement, government, education, taxes. 613 laws. That's it. That's not even close to excessive attention to detail. Tell me this. What detailed instructions does the Bible give about choosing a partner in marriage? What overbearing micromanaging guidance does the Bible give about where to live and where to work? Show me chapter and verse on whether to homeschool, private school, or public school. Which of the 52 local churches in my neighborhood should I attend? Just some of the most important moves we make in our entire lives, and there's almost no specific guidance whatsoever. Principled guidance, missional guidance, not tactical guidance. How about the countless tactical moves I make every day? This morning, I got up at 5 a.m., I exercised, I listened to an Alex Hormozy podcast while I exercised, I spent some time talking with God about the day ahead, I made breakfast for my family, I cleaned up breakfast, I kept the kids on track with their morning responsibilities, I gave my sons instructions for how not to burn the house down while my wife and daughter and I drove to Pete's Honda repair shop to drop off our van. Annie and I stopped and used a gift card to buy a couple of Huckleberry mochas at Wake Up Call on the way to dropping me off at the office. I think you get the point. None of these are clearly outlined in God's direct communication of what he wanted me to do this morning. I could have skipped most of these altogether. I could have rearranged some of them. I could have changed which coffee shop we went to, whose podcast I listened to, what I made for breakfast. I could have done 100 things differently this morning and still kept in line with my commander's intent. The Bible does not live in the tactical. It lives in the missional principles that clarify the strategic and inform the tactical. It communicates the commander's intent. Now, someone asked Jesus one time, what's the most important command? This is a key indicator of what the mission really is. If I asked my boss, what's the single most important thing we are supposed to be doing at Great Northern University, her answer would be the mission of Great Northern University. So when someone asks Jesus, what's the most important command, they might as well have asked, what is the mission that we are on as God's people in the world? And his answer was, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then there's an add-on, love your neighbor as yourself. And if we survey the whole Bible, what we find is that these two things are always connected. In fact, they're so connected, you can't do one without the other. If you say you love God and yet you hate your neighbor, you're lying when you say you love God. If you love your neighbor, that is an expression of love for God. That's why these two go together for Jesus. They are the twofold mission of the church. And we'll come back in a bit to the why of that command, because that's the real core of the intent. That's where we find out what's really going on. Take that hill because it gives us a strategic advantage over the bad guys, and it allows us to hold the ground we have and take more ground and eventually win the war. In other words, win the war is the real mission. Take that hill is actually tactical. Win the war is missional. So we have to ask why love God and love neighbor are the most important commands. That episode coming very soon. But before we come back to the why, we need to go to the Old Testament. When Jesus said loving God is the most important command, he wasn't breaking new ground. Nothing revolutionary or controversial here in the slightest. Now, I know Jesus said some stuff that got him in big trouble. This wasn't one of them. In fact, if he'd said anything else, he'd have been in big trouble because everyone there with him already knew the right answer to the question. They knew love the Lord your God was the answer to the question, what's the most important command? Jesus was not being creative. He was not innovating, not even a little bit. And I know this because when Jesus said the most important command was the command to love God, he was quoting the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6, people call it the Shema, which is the first word meaning hear, or maybe something a bit stronger like listen to this, pay attention to this, and do it. You've heard these lines. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. This is the core thing. This is the mission. Now add to that the other piece of the mission, quoting Leviticus 19, verse 18, love your neighbor as yourself. One thing, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's the main thing, but what do I do with it? Two things, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. Okay, there's a two-part mission, but it's hardly specific enough to tell me exactly what to do in every situation. So let's take those two things and turn them into 10 things. Those 10 things we call the 10 commandments. 10 things that specify a little further how to do the two things. How do I love God and love neighbor? 10 ways. But those 10 things are still pretty broad. Don't bear false witness. Well, what qualifies as false witness? What formal or informal circumstances are in view? Who adjudicates? What's the penalty for breaking this law? The 10 commandments themselves don't answer any of these questions. Keep the Sabbath. Well, how? Limitless possibilities, none of which are contained in the fourth commandment itself. So many questions unanswered. All I have is one thing that prompts two things that prompts 10 things. But we are still miles from knowing how to handle every tactical variable and every opportunity. So, right after these 10 commandments, God gives a couple of chapters of instructions. Exodus 21 to 23, these are called the Book of the Covenant. Same stuff, a little more detail. Then we have Leviticus 17 through 26, which scholars call the Holiness Code, and it's the same stuff again, a little more detail. Then one more time, the laws spoken by Moses on the plains of Moab in Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Here's the key, it's the same stuff. Again, a little more detail. Read the laws in Deuteronomy, and what you find is a longer version of the same things you already saw back on Mount Sinai. Every instruction in Deuteronomy is a slightly more detailed, a slightly closer to the ground application of the mission parameters given in the 10 Commandments, which are themselves slightly more detailed mission parameters for loving God and loving neighbor. But we're still nowhere near home office micromanaging of the tactical moves people are trying to make in real time. The point being, once again, God has given us the mission. He has given us strategic parameters, and He has invited us to make tactical decisions in real time that are focused on that mission and are within those strategic parameters. Now, if I pause here for a second, a bunch of questions come to mind. Each of these probably needs its own episode, and I'll probably come up with more questions as I go along, but for now, here's my list of questions. First question that comes to mind. When I say the mission is to love God and love neighbor, what exactly do I mean by love? I do believe in defining terms on this podcast, because if you and I use the exact same word in two different ways, we're not actually saying the same thing, even though the same sound is coming out of our mouths. And I'm obviously not going to say all that could be said about what love is and what love isn't, but I need some sort of working definition if I'm going to mean what I say and say what I mean. So what love means in this context is a big question. Second question, what's the why? Simon Sinek says, start with why. Jocko Willink says, the why of the mission is the commander's intent. So why is loving God and loving neighbor the one non-negotiable, central, critical, fundamental thing? Going to need some time on that one. Here's another question. How does loving God and loving neighbor fit within the whole improving creation shtick that this podcast has been on since the very beginning? I have said numerous times on this platform that we were created to work, that's improving creation, to rest, that's enjoying creation, and simultaneous to doing both of those things, to worship, that's giving credit to the Creator. So how do those three things, which the way I've described them here must be pretty fundamental to the mission, how do they fit with what I'm now calling the mission, which is loving God and loving neighbor? Now, how about this question? All those laws, the many that I mentioned a minute ago in Exodus 21 to 23, Leviticus 17 to 26, and Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Don't Jesus and the apostles change some of those? Doesn't the New Testament say we don't have to or aren't supposed to do at least some of that stuff? So how does that fit into all this? What's changed? What hasn't changed? And one last question for now. If the Bible doesn't give us all of the tactics, who does? Are we supposed to just make things up and figure it out and hope we're in line with the mission? Or are there other resources we're supposed to engage to fill in those gaps? And like I said, lots of unanswered questions, and I'll spend the next few episodes trying to answer some of them. Until then, I hope you go to your commander and ask him your clarifying questions about his intent. Thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this project is my brother, Ben Kibbe. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Leah Leanhoutz, and of course, music is provided by Dave Murray of Daradoon Guitars. If this series has been helpful or challenging to you, or if you've got a story about extreme stewardship that you'd be willing to share, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. You are, of course, welcome to like and subscribe and tell your friends and all that. What we really care about is that you have gotten better at making things good and good at making things better.